Alright,
Huh.
so
Yeah, there he is. Look at that.
there he is.
There we go. Yeah, I didn't know that either. Yeah, that'll work.
Alright, and now I'm just going to go ahead and get back to that.
I'll make sure it works. Works. Okay, cool. Alright, so my project is titled Last Flag Standing. And so first I'm going to look at my research question, and then I'm going to move into some relevant literature, my methodology, and then my results. So the research question is, how did Mississippi's voters justify their decision to keep the Confederate symbol on the state flag during the 2001 referendum, despite the symbol's potentially problematic nature and history? So a couple of interesting facts are that, first of all, Mississippi was only part of the Confederacy for 4 years, and yet we see this symbol throughout all of our political and cultural life throughout the state and on our state flag. And this issue actually came about in 2000 after a lawsuit from the NAACP sued the state, and the government found that we had never actually adopted a flag. So state legislators and lawmakers decided to put this issue to a popular referendum. And the case is also especially interesting because Georgia had just removed this emblem from their state flag in 2000, and Alabama and South Carolina had also stopped flying this symbol above their state capitals in 1999. So this was Mississippi's first flag. I won't talk about this because we don't have much time. But this is the current flag of the state of Mississippi. And as you see, the Confederate symbol, also known as the Stars and Bars, is in the upper left-hand corner. And lots of people have a problem with this. So in 2001, they proposed this flag, which would replace this with 20 stars, as Mississippi was the 20th state to join the Union. And so what happened? 66% of people in the state of Mississippi voted to keep this old flag with the Confederate symbol. And so this is one of the biggest representations of the state. And so it was interesting that while these other states got rid of this flag at this time, Mississippi chose to keep it. So that's why I wanted to research this issue. So we look at a couple areas of relevant academic literature. We first look at a couple of the studies that have been done on the Mississippi flag, and there are only a very few number of these. The three that we're going to look at today are first the Lieb and Webster article, which talks about different potential determinants for voting outcomes in the state of Mississippi. And now they looked at things like how people voted in the 2001 presidential election, race, religion, ethnicity, and all these other issues. And they determined that race was one of the strongest determinants of the vote. In other words, if you were white, you were going to vote for the old flag, and if you were black, you likely voted against it. Another article examined the Mississippi case versus the Georgia case, and saw that in Mississippi, things were more racially motivated than they were in Georgia. And then finally, in another article by the same author, entitled Accounting for Racism, he looked at the issue of the Mississippi flag and the issue of the 1992 vote in Arizona to make a statewide Martin Luther King Day. And he found that people in Mississippi in particular were more motivated by concepts like history and traditions than people were in other states. So now we're going to look at one of my two primary variables, basically, in today's study, the issue of symbolic voting, which I believe played a major role in the outcome in the Mississippi 2001 referendum. We first look to a book from Womack titled Symbols and Meaning, in which she talks about how symbols are complex and have socially constructed rather than inherent meaning. In other words, everybody who looks at this state flag thinks something differently. It's all about how they construct the meaning rather than a necessarily inherent meaning. In another book from Rossman and Rubel, he states that people will rather deny or give up symbols, die than deny or give up their symbols, and that their identity as members of a group is powerfully bound within this concept. And so this is especially important because, as we see, there are many groups that Mississippians are a part of that they tie to the flag and to these other issues. And then finally, an article about the Mississippi flag itself says that this vote had expressive rather than instrumental consequences. In other words, people thought when they voted for this flag, it wasn't going to change some aspect of their daily life. And this led to different voting outcomes. And then the second issue that we want to look at is that of traditional or traditionalist social conservatism. And there are a couple of different takes on this that all play a factor in the Mississippi flag vote. The first is the philosophy of Edmund Burke, which basically states that we need to keep history as a guide in our political culture. The second was from the Southern agrarians, who stated that rootedness and permanence, in other words, maintaining the status quo, is especially important in Southern political culture. And then finally, and something that I talk a lot about in my study, is this concept of the behavioral immune system, in which systems seek to limit outside fluence, and this specifically talks about political systems. that when people come in and try to change, systems are likely to try and protect their status quo in the same way that antibodies try to protect the body from outside influences. And so the way that I did this study was through a case study format. And I looked at all of the initiatives that had taken place in Mississippi on the ballot, all things that we gave voters the chance to vote on, specific issues. And there were very few because Mississippi only re-legalized this practice in 1992. We actually didn't have this for over 70 years. And so I said there had to be 3 qualities for inclusion in this study. The vote had to be on the ballot. In other words, people had to actually vote on this issue. It couldn't be a failed initiative. It could be seen as symbolic. In other words, it could represent more than just the issue that it actually deals with. And of course, it has to deal with a social issue. And so I only found 2 initiatives that met this criteria. And that was the 2004 Amendment 1 vote to ban gay marriage in the state, and the 2011 Initiative 26 to vote on personhood, or the concept of life beginning at conception. So when we look at the 3 cases, we see that first, in 2001, we do see examples of historically motivated issues. We see an opposition to social change and a maintenance of the status quo. And we even see today, there's an initiative active right now that's trying to make an amendment in the state constitution to bring back The South Will Rise Again in Ole Miss's fight song and establish the state language as English and all these other kind of silly things that other states would see. But it's present in our culture here in this state. And then secondly, my work's kind of already been done for me on the issue of symbolic voting because of the Herrmann and Sugar article. But we also see that this can be symbolic for those who might be trying to represent their racial views and also those with non-racial views. People could see it as symbolic of an attack on our political culture, an attack on our values or their history. But when we look at Amendment 1, we saw that this passed 86%, which was the highest out of any similar initiative across 30 states. The next closest was 81% in Tennessee. And so we see that this could be an example of where these 2 things played a role. Because first, the traditional social conservatism, we see an aversion to change in these established norms about gay marriage. But we also see a new concept, potential ties between religiosity and traditionalist values. Because like we talked about, people's self-concept is often tied to their other groups that they're a member of. So when churches mobilized, when people mobilized across the state, they believed that this was, interrelated. But secondly, we see this is an issue of symbolic voting, and I found that yes. Partially because there were no direct instrumental consequences. This was seen as expressive, because most people, it wasn't going to change how they married or how they acted in their daily life. But also because of, like we talked about, the Rossman and Rubel article, and taking a stand against these changing attitudes across the rest of the country. And then a more interesting example was the Initiative 26 in 2011, because this initiative actually failed. It was the closest to passing other than the one that did pass in Tennessee. But it's interesting because in terms of traditional social conservatism, we again see this tie between religious issues and traditionalism. But also we saw that the changing social acceptance of gay marriage it gave people the opportunity to say, no, we want to keep things the same way here, even though they're changing everywhere else. And then finally, in terms of symbolic voting, there was an interesting poll done after the initiative took place, where the 2 biggest reasons people said they voted no on the initiative was because they thought that it would make in vitro fertilization illegal, 31%, or they thought it wouldn't save the life of the mother in case of medical issues. And this was made if the amendment to make a personhood start at conception passed. And so this is interesting because they saw these instrumental consequences and then rejected it. So in the issues of the flag and the other example, when there wasn't a strong reason for them to believe their life would change, they thought it was okay. But here they might have thought that it was different. So in conclusion, there's examples in each of the 3 that show that symbolic voting and traditional social conservatism may have been influential in the outcomes of these social ballot initiatives, differently than we saw in other states.
One question, and I'll pass it along. You happen to, just curiosity, you happen to know the percentage of the African American population that voted for the flag?
Unfortunately, that was one of the pieces of data I wasn't able to get my hands on. There were either 13 or 14 African American majority counties that voted in favor, but it didn't give actually how many of each race did vote. But like I said, the articles that I found said that predominantly white people did vote, and black people either didn't come out to vote or they didn't vote for the flag.
Well, I mean, I've seen this before, and I still want an answer to my question that I think that Dr. Gibson got at, which is they're not Burkeans, they're racists. Convince me that they're not. And I don't know that it's not necessarily damning to what you've done, but like, I mean, if you had that data, right, you could do something like that. So I don't need you to defend like that, but what else can you do with this? Like, what else did we learn from this? Let's say that we're not racist, that we're just we like tradition. Like, what else does this help explain outside of Mississippi?
So like I talked about in outside, I'm kind of confused by your question, but I'll...
Well, what you found out about the role of tradition affecting politics. Like, so what else, if that is a driving force in why people make decisions in politics more generally?
So specifically in the other two cases, they were not really racial whatsoever. The issue of personhood and the issue of gay marriage. And so we saw, like I said, there's plenty of evidence and specific examples in the way that they were written about that show that this is important in these other ways that our state goes about. But specifically in response to the issue of race within the 2001 vote, like I've mentioned to you a couple of times before, but what I've kind of expanded on is that race can only, like, if you accept the argument that it was a racist vote, then you can't explain anybody who was black and voted for the flag or anybody who was white and didn't, Like, it's kind of like a generalization that these other two studies specifically that said it was race only focused on, like, what your race was and how you voted. They didn't vote, it wasn't about, like, did they believe that, the KKK should rise again or something like that. So in a broader sense, what it does is it opens the literature because there's very little talking about modern day votes on symbols and things like this. So it's about how people respond to these symbols and the meaning that they assign to them. And this was just one example of what some of those could have been.
And just to clarify, do we know that any black people voted for the old flag?
Yes.
Okay.
We just don't know.
But we found one. Did you have a story in there? There was like some sort of vignette from some black person that said, "I'm voting for it because I like tradition."
I mean, I don't have that.
Find one. Yeah, find one of those.
We'll see if
that'll be very helpful.
I should keep looking, and I'm sure that if we found one, that my claims would be a lot stronger than they are.
I agree. That's all I.
I'm wondering about the types of elections these were, and I was here for all three of them, and I can't remember. So you have to tell me.
I think 2004 was the general.
2000. That's actually in my actual thesis. I talk about how some authors say that the issue of gay marriage was put on the ballot in a lot of states to raise turnout for George W. Bush. And so
this was the 2004
the
general.
2004 the gay marriage
general,
amendment.
yeah.
And the other two were not presidential elections. They were just on the yearly, like, local
01 wouldn't have even been a state election, would it? That would have been 03.
Yeah, I don't know.
15, 11, 7, 3.
No.
So my next question would be turnout, particularly in 01 and 11. Any sense of that? In other words, how many people actually voted?
Yes, so less people voted in the 2001 flag election than voted in either of the other two.
And what about the 2011 was kind of a big election.
2000 was a big election, and again, that was because there were a couple of these personhood movements across the country, and it gained a lot of national coverage. So that was another thing that I wrote about that that could be a whole other study, is talking about how turnout and how the campaigns for or against these issues could have played a role in whether they succeeded or failed.
Yeah.
But that was something that, like, this is already a 50-page undergraduate honors thesis, and so I kind of just said that might have played a role.
No.
But I don't know what that role is in this case.
I mean,